Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study, brought to you by St. John the Evangelist in Jackson, Michigan. I will be your host, Todd Gale, as we walk our way through the epic biblical stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Absalom is dead. We're in chapter 18, verse 19. Ahimaaz, now do you remember all these names? There's like 55 names in this chapter. Ahimaaz is the son of the priest Zadok. So he's one of the boys that was the runner, if you remember. He hid in the well in the last scene when Absalom's men were looking for him. He was a runner going back and forth with with the army, trying to get word back and forth to David between Jerusalem. So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, he wants to run forward. He's just a young lad. Let me run up and tell David, I'm so excited. I want to tell the king about what's happened. But Joab, now remember Joab is the man in charge of the military, right? The one that has had lots of interesting back and forth narratives with Joab. Joab wants to tell the story his way. Because remember, he did what at the end of Absalom's life? He kind of betrayed him a bit, yeah? Do you remember? So Absalom's hanging by his neck in a tree. What does Joab do? Yeah, took some spears or darts or something. Kind of tortured him a little bit. Yeah, and didn't even end up killing him all the way. Then somebody else came along. There are 10 others that come along later. So he really kind of probably wants to tell the story his way. So Joab says, no, I'm going to let a Cushite run up ahead. This is in verse 21. Joab says to the Cushite, you go and tell the king what you've seen. But Ahimaaz just can't let go of this idea. He really wants to do it. So Joab says, okay, fine. You can go ahead also. Hi, guys. Welcome. You can go also. And Ahimaaz ran the way of the plain, and he outruns the Cushite. So both of them are now going to run to give word to David. Now, I want to catch something here to make sure that you see this. The person who runs to tell the good news about a battle that's won is called what? Okay, the lucky guy. Messenger is in the middle of it. Angel is in the middle of the term because angel means messenger. So it's the messenger of good news, of a war that has already been won. What would we call that person? An evangelizer. So we get the word evangelization. Yeah, the storyteller. In the middle of that is angel, if you've ever noticed, evangelism. It's the messenger that takes the good news of a battle that has already been won. The battle's over. It's been won. And I'm going to come and share that good news with you. That's what an evangelist is. Isn't that awesome? Ahimaaz here is an evangelizer. He wants to take the good news of the battle. He wants to tell the king. Most of the time, the good news is about the king who has won. But here he wants to take the news to the king. Isn't that kind of interesting? And just like Peter and John in the Gospels, when they run to the tomb, John outruns the older Peter, right? Here, Ahimaaz outruns the older Cushite. And Ahimaaz gets there first. And in verse 24, David is sitting between the two gates. He's in the city of Mahanaim. There's a little text note on that. He's in the city of Mahanaim, and he's sitting between the two gates. And I don't think you would remember this because it was many, many months ago. But this is repeating a situation that happened almost a year ago for us. When Eli, the high priest, was sitting at the gate waiting for word to come to him about his two rebellious boys. I don't know if you remember that. Way back, the priest Eli, the one that trained Samuel, right? His two boys were really bad. They were terrible. They did terrible things. They ended up dying. A runner comes and tells Eli while he's sitting at the gate that the boys are dead. Eli is so stricken, he falls backward. Remember this? And he dies. Yeah, and part of it was because that's when the Ark of the Covenant was captured. It was way back then, way back in the very beginning of 1 Samuel. So this kind of mimicking this a little bit. David is now sitting at the gate. The watchmen are there watching, and a runner is coming up, and the runner is coming up to tell him some news about his son that has died, sort of like with Eli. And the king says, "Oh, look at him. I see him. If he's coming along, there are tidings in his mouth. This is really good." And the watchman says, "Oh, I think I see two people running." In verse 27, the watchman says, "The running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." So Ahimaaz must have ran kind of strangely because they recognized his run. They could tell from miles away, "Oh, I know who that is. He runs like Ahimaaz." So I don't know, maybe he didn't move his arms when he ran or something. I don't know. But whatever it was, he recognized him. And David says, "Oh, he's a good man." Verse 27. And he comes with good tidings, David thinks. Right? David does not know what's happened. So Ahimaaz comes in, and in verse 28 through 31, it's really kind of funny. Ahimaaz, so he's younger, right? He runs up to the king, and he comes up and he has this mouthful of long, flowery words. "Blessed be the Lord your God who's delivered the man who's come against the Lord our king." And the king's like, yeah. "Is it well with Absalom?" Like, get to the point. "What about Absalom? What about my son?" And Ahimaaz keeps talking. "Well, when Joab sent your servant, I saw a great tumult, and I didn't know what it was." And David just says, "Turn aside. I don't have time for this. Let me talk to the Cushite," right? So it's kind of funny. I mean, when you're reading through it, I don't know if you catch it that way, but it's really kind of funny. David is impatient. This boy he's in front of the king. He's enamored. He's talking to the king. King goes, yeah, boy, I want to get the news, right? So he pushes him aside. The Cushite comes along, verse 31, and behold, he has tidings. And what he says, he doesn't come right out and say what happened. He's a little indirect. He's polite about it, but he doesn't avoid the point. He says, the Cushite says, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. May your enemies end the way he ended." So David reads between the lines. You get that? He doesn't come right out and say, he's dead. He's kind of being a little polite, but he's not dodging it either. He basically says, may your enemies end the way he ended. Verse 33 through the rest of chapter 18, David 5 times calls out, my son, oh my son. Oh my son Absalom. Our children may plunge into the worst of sins and evil, but they're still our kids. Amen? Our kids can break our hearts, but they're still our kids. And we see and hear not only the heart of the king, but the heart of God the Father. The cry of Christ when we leave him, right? When we're lost, when things don't go well for us, David is really revealing here the heart of the Father and the heart of Jesus. My son, my son. He has no thought of Absalom's treachery. He's not thinking about what was deserved, right? He's not thinking about all the terrible things Absalom did. All he's thinking about is his son is no longer with him. Right? Can we relate? Yes. Pretty tough. And he wails. There's one thing, I've been reading a lot of things about Judaism and just Jewish culture lately, and the way that impacts so much of Jesus' life. One thing that I've really learned is, man, Jewish people are very expressive with their emotions, and they still are today. The wailing at funerals, just screaming, wailing, carrying on for hours, for days, 7 days of mourning. And David is the king, and he is just carrying on, so much so in chapter 19, Joab feels it's his duty to pull the king back together again. Joab thinks David has gone a little too far. He loved his son so much, maybe he loved his son more than he loved his loyal sons. Maybe he loved his son more than he loved the loyal mighty men who fought for him. Maybe he loved his son more than he loved the lay folks in the nation, more than he loved all of Israel. And Joab says, David, get it together. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. I'm not sure if Joab was right to do that. I don't know. How do you feel about it? Was David over the top? In chapter 19, it was Joab who said, behold, the king is weeping and mourning. And the people heard it that day. He's grieving for his son. The people stole into the city as people, steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and cried, oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son. So he was mourning until the baby died. And once the baby died, it's like he accepted it. He moved on. He cleaned himself up. Remember that? He really pulled it together. What do you think? Right. Well, and what's happening in the geopolitical world around David, Absalom's death means what? Yeah. So there was a lot of upheaval. The leader of the upheaval is dead now. So who's looking at who? Right? The country is looking at the king, saying, what are you going to do now? What's going to happen now? So Joab kind of has a sense of, he's almost like a sense of logic in the middle of this. And Joab is one of those characters I still can't decide until it's over if I like him or not. He goes back and forth all the time. But he's very practical. He's also the one that carried out David's order to murder Bathsheba's husband, right? Yeah. He's the one that carried that out. Thinking of himself as that. Yeah. Joab, when he has helped David, it's always also helped himself. That's one thing. So very worldly in that sense. Yeah. But he's done some amazing things for David, but he's also wanted to make sure that he's not too far from the throne. Now remember, Joab is getting old too. David's older at this point. Joab is not young anymore. He's been with him this whole time, right? So he's getting a little older too. So he needs to be thinking about his future. But I agree, he's telling David, you got to snap out. You got to snap out of this. You're the king, right? This is a huge moment, right?
Because you're the only one that can do this.
You can mourn later if you need to. Or mourn in private. That's great.
Pull the nation together because you're the only one that can do this.
That's awesome. And Joab feels he's the one, it's his duty to bring David back into the throne. So in verse 8, the king arose, took his seat at the gate. He's not in Jerusalem, so he doesn't have a throne. He's not in Jerusalem, so he doesn't have his capital city. So he's going to go to the gate of the city where he is, and that's kind of the place where the leaders are going to go. And he's going to do the best he can to show, I'm back on the throne again. So David does respond to Joab. He pulls it together. Now Israel, it says at the end of verse 8, had fled every man back to his home. So when it's talking about Israel here, we're talking about mostly the northern part of the kingdom. They were in disarray. They were following Absalom. Now they're really confused. They all go back to their homes. David goes back to basically the throne, right? And then in verse 9, all the people are at strife, saying, what is the king going to do? Absalom is dead. Why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? It looks like at this point, because if they've all gone back to their homes, right? The people are talking to an evangelist. They're talking to a messenger, right? Because if they've all gone back to their home, it's like, who are they saying this to? They're saying this to a messenger. Why do you say nothing about the king? So in verse 11, the king David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. So he's sending a message back to Jerusalem. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to your house? Why are you not clamoring for my return, Judah? David's waiting to hear. Judah's not saying anything. Why are you not asking for the king to return? So David is asking Judah, do you want me back as your king or not? Do you want me back? I want to hear from you. People in the north, Israel is all in disarray. What about you people in Judah? He says in verse 12, you are my kinsmen. You are my bone and my flesh. Why should you be the last to bring back the king? So he's asking the people, do you want me to return to the throne? Then he does something very strange. Not a good move. Do you remember Amasa? Again, a name, all these names. Amasa, remember how Joab is the leader of David's mighty men? Amasa was the leader of Absalom's army. And he is also a cousin of Joab. He's a nephew of David. They're all related, right? Amasa was the enemy's head of the army, right? He was Absalom's head of the army. David says to Amasa in verse 13, are you not my bone and my flesh? Are you not my relative? Are you not my nephew? So you go, God do so to me and more also to you, if you are not the commander of my army, henceforth in place of Joab. What's he saying with that sentence? Joab's out. And he's making an oath. May it happen to me or happen to you. May one of us be struck down if you are not now the head of my army. What? Why in the world? This is like the worst time after Joab's the one that kind of held the nation together through all this. And he's replacing Joab with Amasa. What is going through David's mind? Keep your enemies close, maybe.
Well, he did the same thing with...
He did that earlier.
Yeah, he did that with the uncle, remember?
Yeah.
And Joab's the one that killed him.
Right.
Abner.
Right. I'm so confused by all the names.
Joab killed Abner
Right.
against David's
So
command.
David had tried to do this once before. Raise somebody else.
Abner.
Joab ends up saying, no, I'm the guy, right? Watch what's going to happen. Guess what's going to happen to Amasa?
And Joab killed Abner.
Yeah.
Under the same circumstances.
It was it was very, very similar. Yeah, and against the orders of David.
Right.
But it's almost like Joab knows what should be done. But what's missing in all this, though? God. God is not talking to them. They are not talking to God. They're not consulting. Nowhere in here does it say David went and searched the heart of the Lord. Nowhere in here does it say the Lord spoke to David. They're totally working on worldly politics. And Nathan's nowhere to be seen. So for whatever reason, David kicks Joab out of the club, asks Amasa, who was his son, the rebellious son's, the chief military guy, he asks Amasa to now head the army. And then in verse 14, it says, he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, meaning David swayed the heart of Judah back. And word came back to the king, return, both you and your servants. Judah, the people of Judah say, yes, we want you to be our king again. Do we get that? He waited for the people to call him back. So then the king went back to the Jordan, and Judah came to went back to the Jordan, and all of Judah, they come to Gilgal to meet the king and bring the king over to the Jordan. Gilgal is this little area, this little city where Saul was first anointed. And it's the city where Samuel told Saul, you're going to get your kingdom stripped away from you. Right? So it's a really important political place, but it's not Jerusalem. He hasn't gone back home yet. Okay? He's trying to rally the people of Judah first, make sure that they're on his side. Then he's going to go back home to Jerusalem. So on his way back to Jerusalem, now with a new guy as the head of his army, that's a little strange. Keep that in mind. But with that whole... So then we have these weird side stories. It's so frustrating because you're following the flow of this, and then all of a sudden everything turns and it pivots a little bit. Remember Shimei? Of course you do. Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite. So back when David was first fleeing, when Absalom started his rebellion, he was fleeing and he was really depressed. Remember, it was really dark. And there's like this enclave of soldiers that are just all down and they're leaving. This old man named Shimei is cursing at David and spitting at him and throwing things at him, throwing rocks at him. That guy shows up again. Now David is back on the king, back on the throne. He's coming back towards Jerusalem, going back home again, and Shimei shows up again. And along with him, verse 17, Zeba, the servant of the house of Saul. Remember Zeba? He was the Gentile guy that was helping Mephibosheth, also known as Meribah. He's the one that was taking care of the property and was helping Mephi. Remember, he's the turncoat, traitor, Gentile guy. So Zeba and Shimei are there, and David is now coming back towards Jerusalem. And in verse 18, it says, Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king. And in verse 19, says to the king, let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did you wrong. David forgives Shimei for cursing him, for throwing rocks at him, for spitting at him. David forgives him. Abishai, who is Joab's brother, and also one of the merry men of David, right? One of the mighty men of David. Abishai says, I think Shimei should be put to death for this, David. Like, let's kill him in verse 21. But David says, what have I to do with you? And the king says to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. So now we have another scene of David's forgiveness. David's mercy. On one hand, David is like flaking out. He's like making really, and then all of a sudden he's showing mercy again. So then you're going, oh, okay, all right, maybe he's getting back on track again. I don't know. Let's see what happens next. Well, and here's another reason I think this is a mercy thing, Mike, is because right afterwards, David and Mephibosheth meet. So so he's coming back to Jerusalem. Remember, Mephi is the lame son of Jonathan, right? He's also known as Meribah in the Chronicles, right? So when last we heard of him, David came across Zeba. When David was fleeing, he comes across Zeba, who is the servant that's helping Mephibosheth, right? And Zeba's got all these donkeys laden with all this stuff. And he says, oh, I'm giving this as a gift to you, David. And oh, by the way, Mephibosheth, he really wanted to turn against you, and he's joining Absalom, and he wanted to revolt against you. He wants the throne. So David is really upset. He's like, man, I was good to this guy. What's this about? Well, now he runs into Mephibosheth. Okay? So David thinks Mephibosheth wanted the throne. He wanted to join the rebellion. This is where David is coming from. He meets Mephibosheth. So this is chapter 19, verse 24. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And actually, he's the grandson of Saul, right? Because he's Jonathan's son. To meet the king, he had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes. He's in a state of mourning, right? And the king sees him. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king said, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" I like the fact that David says his name. There's just something very in your face and personal. Why didn't you join me? When I was leaving, when I was fleeing from Absalom, why didn't you join me? Why did you stay in the capital city? Because Zeba told me you wanted to take the throne. Mephibosheth answered, "My lord, my king, my servant deceived me," meaning Zeba, deceived me. "Your servant," meaning me, Mephibosheth, said, "Saddle a donkey for me, that I may ride on it and go to the king. For your servant is lame." But he slandered your servant to the Lord your king. In other words, he slandered me. He took my donkey that I laden up for you, David. He took the donkey out from underneath me and then slandered me and said that I was trying to defeat you as the king. He slandered your servant, meaning he slandered me to my lord the king, to you. Verse 27. "My lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you." Mephibosheth had it taken from him. Zeba lied. And then if you remember this, David does something really weird. Another weird mercy thing. Verse 29, the king says, "Why speak any more about this? I've decided what we're going to do. You and Zeba shall divide the land." And this is all of King Saul's property that was over in, I forget which part of Benjamin territory, where King Saul originally had all his property. And Mephibosheth was the inheritor, right? He's the only one left. He was going to inherit it. Zeba was the one taking care of that property. The king offered to split it between the traitor Zeba, the Gentile traitor, and Mephibosheth. Why would he do that? That is like, it seems really merciful on one hand, and yet it seems really weird on another hand too. But Mephibosheth says to the king, "Let him take it all. All I want is you." So Mike's thought is that without the guidance of the Holy Spirit, without the guidance of God, David is acting only from a human, kind of a human logic. I don't even know if
How can you discern the truth?
So he's not really discerning. He's just kind of saying, "Okay, let's go ahead, because I can't make up my mind. I'm going to do it." What do you think? What's remarkable about this, the narrator gives us no motivation. No idea what's going on in David's mind. There's no mention of God, as Jack has pointed out. So then it continues with more strangeness and more character names. So now David, there's a guy named Barzillai. I guess that's what we'll call him, Barzillai. Barzillai is very old. He's back in this day. This is really old. He's in his 80s. He's 80 years old. And in that time, not a lot of people lived to be 80. So he's the Gileadite. He comes down and he sees David. He's a very aged man, in verse 32. He had once, long ago, if you remember the name, he had provided the king with some food in one of the merry adventures when people came and provided the king and the mighty men some food. And he provided some food, and David remembered him. And David said, "Oh my gosh, I want to honor you. I want to offer you, come with us, come to Jerusalem and join us. Go up with the king to Jerusalem." And basically there's just a lot of talk that basically it just goes back and forth. In verse 37, he just says, "Please let your servant return that I could die in my own city. I'm just too old for anything like this. Like, I don't want any more adventures." This is like, in Lord of the Rings, this is like Bilbo saying, "I don't want any more adventures. I'm old now. I just want to die in peace. But here, take my servant, Chimham. Let him go with my lord the king, and you can do with him whatever you see fit. Chimham will go over with me." So the king went to Gilgal, and Chimham went with him. There's like multitude of verses in there just to tell us that little story. I sometimes I marvel at why some things are in Scripture, unless there's more to it that I'm just not missing, that I'm missing. But Barzillai seems like a very nice guy. David wants to honor him. Instead, he ends up taking his servant, and they go on their merry way. He's still not in Jerusalem, right? He's still traveling back to Jerusalem. Now there's more dissension between Israel in the north and Judah. So in verse 41, all the men of Israel, now this is using very exaggerated language. It's not every single man in Israel, I'm sure, right? Or every single man in Judah. What's that?
All the people in Judah, half the people.
Oh, and half the people. All the men of Israel in the north, they come to the king and they basically say, hey, did you forget about us? We have your brethren, the men of Judah. Why have your brethren, the men of Judah? Why have the people of the south stolen you away? In verse 42, all the men of Judah answered, because he is our kin. Why have we stolen him away? Because he belongs to us. And the people in the north, and Israel says, hey, we have 10 shares of the kingdom. We have 10 tribes. You only have 2. So who's the best one here? Like, who really deserves the king? Who deserves all the attention? So as the chapter ends, there is unresolved tension between, guess what? Israel of the north and Judah in the south. Unresolved tension is growing again. It's like parishes, yeah. Where the bishop has told us we're going to unify our parishes, and now we're fighting over who's got the most people. So there's more and more tension. Remember how all this started? The Benjaminites is where Saul was from. They were mad at everybody. Nobody liked anybody, right? There's all the rest of the north. There's all the people of the south. They finally kind of came together. Now they're all split up again. And the story isn't over. Chapter 20, there's another rebellion. Not a whole lot happens. Why is this even here? It fleshes out a little more of the characters of Joab. It fleshes out a little more of his ruthlessness. It kind of fleshes out a little more ambition. But it doesn't really reveal anything new about David or about where the country's going. It's like this little detour side story again. Sheba is a Benjaminite. Remember, Benjaminites, that's where Saul's from, right? It says he is a worthless fellow. Chapter 20, verse 1. Some translations say he's a scoundrel. So Sheba blows the shofar. That's the ram's horn, right? He blows the shofar, which is a sign for war. And he basically has this exaggeration where he says, we have no portion in David. We have no inheritance. Every man to his tent in Israel to grab your weapons is basically what he's saying. Go to your tent, grab your weapons. We're going to mount a rebellion against David. So verse 2 says, all the men of Israel withdrew from David. Probably an exaggeration. But as a whole, Israel withdrew from David, followed Sheba, and the men of Judah followed David steadfastly. So now we've got another civil war. David and his men in the south, Israel in the north. David then, verse 3, a really strange and kind of unjust act, I think, in the story of things. In verse 3, David came back to his house in Jerusalem. Oh, he's finally back in Jerusalem. So he gets back home. And the king took those 10 concubines who he had left to care for the house. And remember what happened to those 10 concubines? Absalom came and defiled them publicly on the rooftop. So David puts them in a house under guard and provided for them but never again went into them. Basically, he keeps them as concubines, but refuses to give them the dignity to mother any of his children. What a weird thing. Why doesn't he just let them go?
Forgiveness there.
There's no forgiveness there.
But also,
He is protecting them. He's protecting them.
had relations with them.
Right,
If they now are with child, any of them.
right. Oh, that's true.
This is a threat to the
Yeah.
throne.
Oh, good point. Good
Therefore,
point. If there were any children that were conceived, they're kind of out of the picture. He's going to care for them.
And nor is he going to have relations with
Right.
them because there could be questions.
Whose child is that? That's awesome, Jan. That's pretty good. But again, though, it's another thing where he's not consulting the Lord. He's making these decisions that just kind of on the outside, like you're going, what? It's so inconsistent.
But he does
It's so inconsistent. What's that?
But he does provide.
He does provide for them, which is yeah, because they would have no other way for
He
provision.
doesn't put him to death.
Right. Because if they were defiled by Absalom, chances are not too many other men would want to marry them either, right? So what a horrible, what just a terrible situation. The whole thing is terrible. So anyway, that little sentence is thrown in there. Verse 3. But then the king says to Amasa, remember Amasa now is the guy in charge of the army. He says, basically, I'm just going to shorten this up a bit. Basically, he says, call all the men together. You have 3 days to raise an army. And Amasa says, what? Not even Joab can raise an army in 3 days. But the king says, that's what I'm calling you to do. So he has 3 days to gather the army. Joab would have said, no way, I'm not going to do it. But Amasa tries. Abishai, who now is the brother of Joab, all of these guys are cousins. All of these guys are nephews to David. Okay. In verse 6, David says to Abishai, now Sheba has raised up this army, right? This revolt to do us harm. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him. So Abishai, you do it, because obviously Massa can't raise an army. So Abishai, you take the merry men. You take my mighty men, my little private army, the mighty men, which includes, guess who's one of the mighty men? Joab. Take Joab and all the mighty men, and you go and try to stop this guy Sheba, because Massa cannot raise an army fast enough. Okay, are you with me? That's kind of what's going on. David says to Abishai, so go ahead and do that. So they went after, verse 7, they went out after Abishai, Joab, and the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. They went out to pursue Sheba. And Amasa comes to meet them. So remember, he was supposed to form the army. He couldn't do it. He ends up meeting them. Joab comes up to Amasa. He's wearing a sword in his sheath, fastened upon his loins. And in verse 9, Joab says to Amasa, it's really good to see you, my brother. And he grabs him by his beard and gives him a kiss. It's like this little kind of roughhouse play. And he tugs on him and he gives him a little friendly Jewish brotherly kiss thing. And he drops his sword and he goes down to pick up his sword. And then he takes his sword and stabs Amasa and leaves him there bleeding to death. Joab struck him with it in the body. It looks like he either, he did it in a way where he dropped the sword and the sword was just a diversion. They go down to pick up the sword and he's got a dagger in his hand and he stabs them. It looks like maybe that's what happened. Or somehow he grabbed the sword and sticks him with it. But whatever happens, Joab tries to kill Massa. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, they then pursue Sheba. So they leave Massa there to die. They go off to pursue Sheba, who's the one that started this rebellion. One of Joab's men, this is verse 11, took his stand by Amasa and said, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. Meanwhile, Amasa lay wallowing in his blood on the highway. And one of the men saw him and stopped, and he carried Amasa off the highway into the field and threw his garment over him, as Amasa slowly bleeds to death. Isn't this weird? What is the point of this? No mention of God. Bloodshed after bloodshed. Now Joab is back in charge again. Why did David do that in the first place? I'm perplexed by the whole thing. So in verse 14, Sheba passes through all the tribes of Israel, gathering up men, right? This is Sheba, the rebellion, the guy that's starting the new rebellion. And they go to a city, a walled, fortified city. And all the men who were with Joab come and besiege him in Abel of Beth Makkah, whatever. In verse 15, it's a walled city. So Sheba has gathered this army. They go into this walled city. Joab and the men are now gathering around the city. And in verse 16, there's a wise woman within the city. Another wise woman. She's about the fourth one in the story of Samuel, where there's Abigail. There was the witch of Endor, who actually turned out to be, she was actually kind of wise in a sense. There was, remember that other lady, that other prophetess that told the story to, I can't even remember now. I can't even remember the situation now.
Joab had her tell the story.
Yeah, Joab had her tell the story. Yeah, there was like another parable, remember that? And now there's another wise woman. And there's no consensus. The Jewish writers and the Christian writers, I looked at all kinds of different stuff. Some say she's a prophetess. So she's a prophet, a female prophet. Some say she's a princess in the town. Some say she's just a leader. Not really sure who she is. She's never mentioned by name. But this wise woman calls from the city and says, it's very interesting, the language here. Hear, hear. Tell Joab, come here. In Hebrew, she would be saying, Shema, Shema. You ever heard that before? Shema, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. I am the Lord your God. This is God language. Hear, hear. Shema, Shema, she says. And he comes to her. And she says, are you Joab? So she knows who he is. She knows something about the story. Sounds like maybe she's connected. She's asking for them to shema, to listen. She says, she knows that he is Joab. And she says, listen to the words of your maidservant. These are God and Mary kind of words being used here. There's something about her that really intrigues me. I almost wonder, hearkening to Jack's whole theory, if this is the Lord trying to speak to them through her. Shema, Shema, O Israel. Shema, Shema, O Joab. Shema, Shema, David. Listen to me. Listen to the words of your maidservant. And he said, I am listening. That just cracks me up. I don't know why. I am listening. She said, they were wont to say in old time, let them but ask counsel at Abel. And so they settled the matter. So in other words, what she's saying is, this is an old town. People come here for counsel. People come to this town because we're wise here. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. Sounds like she's more than just a wise woman. She might be a prophet. And you seek to destroy a city which is a mother city in Israel. You know, that's kind of where we get that image of the mother city, right? She's old. Other cities have been birthed from this old city. You know, this is a happening place, this city here. You don't want to burn us down. Why would you swallow up all that heritage of the Lord? Another way to say that is, why would you swallow up all of the inheritance that's here? We are God's people, and we are peaceful, and we're known for being wise. So hands off our city, dude, right? That's what she's like, don't do anything bad here. Joab says, well, I'll tell you what, if you just give him up, I'll withdraw from the city. And she goes, oh, okay, that's easy. So she cuts off his head and throws his head over the city wall, and the whole rebellion is over. Sheba's just his head's chopped off. It's all done.
Sounds like the story of Judah.
It sounds like the story of Judah. Judah. Oh, Judith. Yes. Yeah, the story of Judith. And if you remember the story of Judith in the Old Testament with the cities besieged, and yeah, they end up just kind of, she goes and just chops off the guy's head, and she, I never even thought of that. There is. It's similar to, it's Judith is the whole book. This is just one little paragraph. But it's so weird building up to it. You're like, wow, this is intriguing. It's almost like the voice of the Lord talking. And then in like 2 sentences, behold, his head shall be thrown over the wall to you. And he just chops off his head and it's over. The whole rebellion's done. Like, what is happening? The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Right? What is happening here? The woman went to the people in wisdom. They cut off the head of Sheba and threw it out to Joab. What kind of a rebellion is this guy if some wise woman in the city can just go up to him and chop off his head, right? So he blew the trumpet and dispersed from the city every man, and Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. So it sounds like Joab has now once again been the winner. Joab again goes back to David, and again Joab is back in the saddle again. And then verse 23 through the rest of chapter 20 is just sort of a list of court officials. It just kind of gives us a little roster of how David is reigning in the kingdom. His sons are no longer mentioned. There are no sons mentioned here.
Solomon's still a little boy, isn't he?
Solomon is just a little tyke at this point, or at least a young lad. We haven't heard a thing from Solomon yet. And technically, with some of the scrolls that we found of 2 Samuel, some of the scrolls end here. And oh, it would be a good place to stop. Some of the scrolls end here. But chapters 21, 22, 23, 24 are like an appendix. There's no order to them. We're not going to go into those today because we're going to go back and read stuff now. But chapter 21 onward is like an appendix. It just kind of adds some backstories. They're not in order. It's not in any kind of specific. It's a little strange kind of the way. And we've even looked at a few of these as we've gone. We've popped back and forth onto some of those. But the story, the narrative part kind of ends here. David is back on the throne. And he's old. He's not going to be on the throne very long. Joab is back as the head of his military. Absalom's rebellion and Sheba's rebellion are both overthrown. Right? Yeah. And we look at, we've been joking about how this plays out through history, the same thing. Change the names, right? Change the names. It's the same story over and over and over through history. That's what happens when we don't have the Lord in the middle of our lives. Right? It's the reason God gives Israel all those rules about don't sleep with cattle and don't have relations with your mother and your sister-in-law and your, and all these weird, bizarre rules on morality and sexuality and stuff. The reason he gives them those rules is because that's what they were doing in Egypt. Right? And the reason Christ brings that rule up is because that's what they were doing in Rome and Greece and Babylon and America, right? That's why those come up, because when you pull God out of the equation, that's what it evolves into every time. That's what we're seeing in our world. You take God out, that's what you see, this. The same stuff. That's great. Yeah, so your homework, dig through and see if you can find any reference to the Lord speaking or them praying anywhere in there. I don't think there is. Okay, starting in 12. No, I knew there was a big stretch where there wasn't, but I hadn't really followed.
Thanks for joining us in the Catholic Community Scripture Study as we walk through 1st and 2nd Samuel.